That's true. Let's see. Everybody, let me just.
Hello.
Hey, good, excellent. I just want to make sure I have the right earphones on. Good, thanks. All right, welcome. I wanted to finish up our discussion today about technologies and do that a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen here in a second. And then we're going to do talk some about how these technologies worked and try out, just sort of talk through how the futures market worked and have you divide up into groups and make some decisions about what to do in the case of changes in international prices. Okay. Bear with me while I pull up the PowerPoint. Okay, we just want to conclude the discussion of the Gilded Age West. We talked about the way in which the railroads allowed these new settlements. In Central California, there's a settlement that goes all the way back to 1849. But as the railroads are expanding through the West, they require more laborers, and those are mostly Chinese laborers, mostly brought in on contract. And then we talked about some sort of second tier cities that emerged, where manufacturing is regionalized for the first time. So rather than, so you have towns and things like that that produce, say, watches or tires or things like that, because there is, for the first time, a kind of national market. That machinery is mostly borrowed from other places. So the Bessemer process that Carnegie uses for steel is actually swiped from Britain. The fractional distillation is something that's perfected in Germany, but Flagler and Rockefeller use it. Many of these workers that are coming in are skilled workers who've actually got their skills elsewhere, mostly in Germany. You have kind of Yankee owners, but the actual skilled workers themselves are mostly German immigrants who have been 10 or more years out. I wanted to talk about energy now, very briefly. So Helmholtz is a kind of a crazy dude who is, bear with me. He's actually a doctor, and he gets training in physics and other things like that, but he's really just an amateur. But he reads a little more broadly than most physicists and chemists do in this period, and he comes up with this argument that basically says, well, we've in the 18th century, it was already proved that you can't have a perpetual motion machine. If that's true, then mechanical force must be interchangeable and convertible into heat, light, electricity, and magnetism. All of these must be forces that are connected to each other, and the more heat, light, electricity, or magnetism is generated, if that's not the if you're say trying to use produce steel or control some mechanical process, the more heat and light that's generated, the more you're wasting this energy. This actually becomes really important. It's basically where we get the first and second law of thermodynamics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed, but becomes more, more chaotic over time and breaking down into these other forms of energy. It's this that makes the Bessemer process, or helps explain the Bessemer process, because previously there had been iron would be heated and cooled and heated and cooled and heated and cooled until you got steel out of it. The insight that comes for Bessemer is that if all of this is done with one blast, that the cost in terms of heat and would be considerably less. And so this is where we get the Bessemer process, where a tremendous amount of iron is heated up. You skim off the junk, you pour out finished steel, and then what's at the bottom is cleaned out as dross. Fractional distillation is a similar process, where basically before people had taken oil and would produce things like petroleum gases and naphtha and kerosene and lubricants. What was left over was lubricants, but they would be, again, heated and cooled and heated and cooled. The idea behind Helmholtz is that this should all be done at one time to sort of preserve the energy and make it the whole process potentially more efficient. And this is where we get basically crackers. If you've ever driven through New Jersey on the way to New York, those big kind of spherical things, the sort of towers that you see, are crackers that are basically taking oil and turning it into these other goods, including kerosene. The valuable thing for Rockefeller was the kerosene at this point. Gasoline is not really used for anything initially. It's only later that gasoline is made. Gasoline is horrible for lamps, because if a lamp is filled with gasoline and the lamp falls over, it'll burn the house down. What you want with kerosene is something that's kind of gloopier, so that if the thing falls over, it's not going to quickly spread. Lubricants and waxes, basically Rockefeller and others figure out all sorts of ways of using this. So these are sort of technologies that are really important for understanding basically how Rockefeller was able to defeat his competitors, and how Carnegie is able to defeat his competitors. Another bigger thing that's happening is standardization. So this is the Colt Armory in 1856 that's producing interchangeable rifle parts, and the energy that's being used for the first time is coming from steam engines, and the steam engines are connected by these belts to the workers themselves, and so they have these devices that provide them kind of portable energy to make it easier to produce shoes in a line. One worker doesn't make the whole shoe. One worker will do just lasting, or just putting in, poking the holes for the shoelaces, or just attaching the sole to the shoe itself. And this is a similar kind of assembly line with women in textiles. And you can see again the straps overhead, the power being distributed from either a steam engine or a water mill. What Carnegie does then, taking this principle of the conservation of energy and trying to minimize the amount of energy that's expended in the production of things, is to create this sort of revolutionary works, the Edgar Thomson works, which is finished in 1872. And this is a Google Maps view of it. It's still in operation, although it's not nearly producing as much as it used to. The big thing for Carnegie was to produce steel rails. Iron rails were wore out after 3 or 4 years. Steel rail could last 20 years because steel is so much more supple than iron. It can expand and contract without breaking. And so he has if you look on the left there, there's a kind of let me see if that's where this is going. Yeah, so the iron, the raw iron, and the coal that's being used to power this steam engine is coming in on the left of this image by water, because that's the cheapest way to deliver these goods, is by water. It's then being used to power the Bessemer mill, which is taking iron and turning it into steel. And so the iron works is on the left, that big round thing is where the Bessemer Works was initially. And then further down is the rolling mill, which doesn't even let the steel cool before rolling it and stretching it and cutting it into steel rails. Does that make sense? So this whole process is taking advantage of the sort of conservation of energy, heating it up, producing the steel, and then instantly rolling it out and instantly slicing it up so that it never has to be reheated, thus saving a tremendous amount of energy. And this cost means that Carnegie can produce steel rails for half the price of his competitors. So if in a broader sense, there's technology. When we think about technology, I'd like to suggest that technology is in the broadest sense is not steam engines, it's not steam drills, it's not actual objects. It's a form of knowledge that deals with the transformation of the material environment in a flow of economic goods and services. So it's not just machines, it's not just physical capital, but it's the role of human knowledge in, oh, and I'm missing the chat here, sorry. That's embodied in workers, managers, scientists, not just in the machinery. Oh, safe. No, they were not safe. And in fact, you can look in Carnegie's, well, actually, in the Pennsylvania Railroad, I haven't looked at Carnegie's letters, but in the Pennsylvania Railroad, they would pay $5 for every worker that was killed particularly around these works, which are incredibly dangerous. Yeah, and people would like fall into these furnaces and be cooked alongside the iron. Very easy to lose an arm or a leg. This is molten steel that's being moved along this process. They're trying to make it as safe as they can, but it's really not safe at all. No, so they weren't doing this yet in Europe. This continuous processing that Carnegie does and that Colt does and that Rockefeller does, all of them are continuous processing, is relatively new. It's probably part of the reason that this is done especially well in the United States is because there's a lot more free land. And so it's possible for Carnegie to buy up all this real estate to make it possible just to stretch out and make a factory that goes from one end to the other, raw material on one side, finished product on the other. Safety measures were only implemented largely from unions. So unions are developing in this period. They're challenging the authority of managers. Managers were refused to deal with unions, but particularly for skilled workers, they couldn't do without them. And so skilled workers unions, the craft unions are start to push back. But for certain things like the air brake, which was a safety measure that basically ensured that there was a brake on every railway track, it took a number of strikes before railroads introduced these things. Occupational safe and health administration is really a progressive era change, but the union movements go all the way back to the 1730s. There's a blacksmiths union in Charleston, but the unions become more important in the 1850s and 1860s. And unions are a little bit more like fraternities than they are today. So you'd basically join a union, but it was a secret society. You had a secret swearing in. You didn't necessarily mention that you were in a union because it was illegal in some states, or you were very likely to be fired if it was discovered that you were in a union. They're very much like, yeah, they're very much like guilds. In fact, you'd speak this sort of language, this sort of old Latin when you swore yourself to defend yourself and your brothers. But it had to be secret all the way up until the 1880s and 1890s. The exception is the railroad brotherhoods, where there were enough of them that after 1877, the Great Railroad Strike, the locomotive engineers, locomotive firemen, and the maintenance of waymen each had unions that the railroads, in many cases, were willing to deal with. So they're very much like guilds, yeah. Okay, so technology then, we need to think of more broadly than just counting steam drills or counting steam engines. And that's why one of the most important technologies, I think, for this period is the futures market. So what I'd like to do next is, how many are there of us? I'm going to stop sharing. 24, okay. So, can I see everybody on the same screen? 5. Okay. All right, the folks who are with last names A through M, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Excellent. Okay. A through M, you are bulls. N through Z, you are bears. Last name. And Timon, I'm going to catch you as a V if that's okay. All right. So you are in a futures market. It is Group 1, the bulls. It's September, and the December price for wheat is 70. So that means that the price of wheat per bushel is 70 cents, and but that's with a settling date of December. You're sure that grain prices are going to go up by December. What do? Do you buy now, or do you buy later? The price is 70. You think it's going to get to 90. I'd like you to vote. Let me see if I can do this now. Polls, edit, and I still can't figure out how this. Okay, here we are. Okay, so just the bulls, I'd like you to vote on this. Okay, we've crossed the threshold. You bought the wheat at 70, and so you bought 100 shares of wheat at 70, and so you are right now, you're down 70, but you bought it at 70, but it turned out that by the time the final settlement was reached and you got all the grain that you wanted, you had to pay 71 on average. So you're down $7,100 right now. It's September, and the bears, now that the bulls have bid up the price of wheat to 7,100, you think that the price of wheat is going to go down. So what do you do? What can you do? You short it. Okay. What that means is that you're going to issue contracts, right? You're going to say, I promise to sell wheat at a particular price, and let's say the current price is 71. So I promise to sell 100 shares of wheat at 71 on December 1st. Does that make sense? You're shorting wheat because you think the price of wheat's going to go down, right? Okay. So the expression bulls and bears, where does that come from? Bulls, when they attack you, they hit you with their horns on the front and they knock you up in the air. And so they move prices up. And they expect prices to go up. So they're dangerous, and they hit you in the front and they cause prices to go up. Bears, if you've ever seen The Revenant, you know that bears grab you and cut up your back, right? That's how you die. They tear off your back, or they reach and they knock you down. So so bears expect the price to go down, and they're hitting you from behind. Does that make sense? So this is, nobody is quite sure where this term comes from, but that's the closest approximation I've gotten, and it's around this time that the bulls and the bears phrase emerges. So okay, so bears, I'm going to let you decide if you want. Are you going to sell futures at the current price of 71? And here we go. Launch poll. Oh, nope, sorry, wrong poll. This is the most ridiculous thing. Okay. Where do I do this? Poll and polling. And then I choose a different poll. And then I launch it. By the end of the semester, I will figure out how to do this. So this is just the bears who are deciding. Oh, no. Ooh, it's neck and neck. Fine. I think not all the bears are voting, but we've got 9 out of 12, so that's enough. 6 out of 12 is. I need one more bear to vote. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and say that you did sell the futures at 71. Okay, 2 to 1 for selling futures. All right, so bears, you have sold 100 futures at 71, and the trouble is that because you were selling futures, the price went down, and you got so what you got was 70. So you now have $7,000 because you've sold 100 futures, $70 each, right? Okay. Now it's October 1st. Bad crops are announced in Britain. Grain as prices have now gone up to 75 because the biggest consumer of grain, or one of the biggest consumers of grain in the world, is Great Britain. So bulls, what do you do now? Do you buy or sell? All right, sorry. I'm not watching the chat. That's right. Bye. Okay. Polls. Buy or sell. Okay, so this is for the bulls first. And I misspelled sell. Okay. All right. So the bulls have bought at 75. So wow, okay. So you're now out, not just the 7,100, but also out the 7,500. Right? Okay. So you're 14,600 in the hole. Okay. Bears, what are you going to do? Let's see. I cannot understand how to do this thing. Buy or sell. I'll relaunch a poll. Okay, this is for the Bears. Do you buy or sell? I don't have as many Bears as I'd hoped. I think we have a small number of Bears. Okay, so it's a sell. Okay, all right. So the Bears played it safe. They sold at 7,500, and okay, so you made a profit. Is that right? The Bears. Oh, wait a second. You're selling. Oh, hold on a second. All right. I'm going to stop doing the polling, and we'll move on and we'll just talk about what happens. All right. So that's October 1st. We had news that bad crops were announced in Britain. Then in November 1st, we hear news that Odessa, which is in Ukraine, has a bumper crop. And in fact, hundreds of ships from Odessa are now traveling all around the world, including Britain, all over Europe, selling grain. And the price has gone down to 65. So the Bears are, where are the Bears and where are the Bulls now? I'm crying. That is in the imagination. Who's hurting now? Bulls are in debt. Okay. So the Bulls who bought twice are now in trouble because they bought twice at 70 and 75. The Bears who sold twice, who issued futures twice, are now in great shape, right? So you guys are sitting pretty. Okay. Now it's settling time. I'm not going to keep doing the polls. Now it's settling time, and it turns out that some Chicago businessman has cornered the grain market, and the grain market is now at 90. Okay. Right? He's controlling all the grain, or most of the grain, in Chicago. And now the Bulls are on top, right? The Bulls have bought twice at a relatively low price. The settling price is 90. Now the Bears have issued 2 sets of contracts. Now I obviously didn't let you make a decision in November, but things have entirely turned around, right? And so now the Bears are in serious trouble. The Bears have issued these contracts, and one thing to think about, and this is a little bit different from the stock market or other kinds of markets. The futures market means that those Bears who have issued those contracts have to buy the grain somewhere. December 1 is the settling date, right? So this is December 1 grain that's being sold. So you guys have to go around to the grain traders, right, and find someone who's going to sell you grain. But because this dude has cornered the market, he's going to keep charging you more and more and more to settle your payments. Does this make sense? So this is why the futures market is different from a lot of other earlier markets, is that you actually have to settle that grain and you have to sell it. A lot of it, people are trading the difference in the price. So, all right, the price is 90, I've lost money, I'm going to pay the difference. or all right, the price has gone up, I'm gonna get the difference. But here, there really has to be settlement on December 1st. And so that's how a corner is possible, because somebody has bought up all the grain and is forcing the people who have to settle. A friend of mine, actually a student of mine, who's an economics major, one of his friends worked for Morgan. Actually, somebody else here worked in the grain trade, but he worked for Morgan for a while, and he was dabbling in the futures market with his account at Morgan, and he lost about $3,000, and it was more than that, quite a bit of money. And not only did he have to was he made fun of at the water cooler for having lost quite a bit of money, but they made him go to Chicago and deliver the grain, right? Because he was used to dealing with prices and didn't actually realize that grain had to be delivered on that date, on the settlement date. Oh, Evan, you got to figure it out. Okay, you beat the guy up, and all right, awesome. Cigars all around. Okay, so this is the bull, and this is what cornering the market is, right? So the people who benefit from cornering the market in general are the bulls, right? Because the cornering the market brings the price up. But as we saw in Cronin, you can't always control that, because the price is going to drop, and it's actually going to drop way below its trading price of, say, 70. So he's got to unwind all that grain and sell all that grain really quickly. Excellent. Okay, so I don't want to force anyone to get into the futures market. It's not pretty, and there's all these other things like collaring and stuff like that. You can bid against yourself. But let's say if you're a farmer who has wheat in the ground, what do you do with that fear that Odessa is going to have a good grain harvest, right? You're a farmer. You're going to produce 8,000 roughly bales of wheat, and it's going to harvest in December. How are you going to play this market to prevent yourself from losing everything? Right? What you're going to do, excellent, is you're going to sell futures in advance to stabilize revenue. You're not going to sell all your futures. You're going to sell 1/5 of your crop as futures, right? Or 1/8 of your crop as futures. That's called a hedge. So if the price goes up, great, right? You're selling your wheat and the price has gone up, and you've made quite a bit of money, and you've lost money as a futures person, as a bear. You've lost money as a bear, but that's okay, right? You made a great deal of money. The price went up. So that's called a hedge. It's basically designed to protect you as a farmer from a drop in price because of the Odessa market. If you're a miller, you're buying grain and you're selling bread, or sorry, selling flour. And you have to keep your mill running constantly, right? And so what you're going to do is buy futures to stabilize the price. If the price goes up, then you're fine, because you bought futures at 70 and it went up to 90, but you've already bought the futures and you're set. And if the price goes down, well, you lost. You could have gotten it cheaper. But the crucial thing is that the price is more or less stable. So you know what your December price is going to be. And so you're going to be a bull. You're going to buy that future grain, recognizing that the price might go down, but it's too important to you for the price not to go up drastically. So you might play that a little bit just the way the farmer does and say, all right, I'm going to buy futures on half and expect that the other half, I'm going to buy it at whatever the market price is at the time. Does that make sense? So what the futures market allows you to do is for both buyers and sellers to hedge, buyers and sellers to kind of cope with the swinging market prices that can hurt them in one way or another. A farmer is going to be hurt if the price goes down. A miller is going to be hurt if the price goes up. And that's the attraction of having having a futures market. Does that make sense? So the math on this is complicated, but it is true. It's hard to prove, but it is true. Yeah, the millers also might buy 1/5, although in a practical sense, millers often just historically millers just bought almost everything that way. Yeah, they have to sell it, right. It's not interchangeable. They have input costs, so they can mark up the product. The demand is inelastic. So often what millers do. So what's important about every futures market is there has to be a counterparty, right? There has to be a party that benefits, and there has to be a party that loses if the price goes up and down. Does that make sense? Because if there's not, like, you have the people who are betting on the price one way or another, like you guys did, but every futures sorry every futures market is sort of premised on there being two people, a buyer and a seller, or there are other places like microchips or other things like that, but often it's a buyer and a seller who want some stability, and they want to be able to sort of buy that stability. Why their building looks like the first. It's that's the most tasteless building. Anyways, okay. So it's worth thinking about the futures market as a technology, because it's a technology that is many people who get on the exchange and a future are people who have a lot of maybe knowledge of farmers most loss sensitive, so contracts tend to favor buyers. And this will affect how the sort of opportunities work out. And in fact, in the 1870s, when this futures, 1860, so it turns out Cronin is wrong about when the futures market starts. The futures market starts in December of 1863, and it starts actually with the Union Army. Now, he doesn't mention the Union Army or the Civil War at all in this, but this is the Chicago Board of Trade says that the futures contract started actually in December of 1863, and this was because the Union Army needed grain for mills. It also needed oats for horses, and it wanted absolute settlement. So that's why the futures market has absolute settlement. You can't buy your way out of the problem. You have to deliver if you issue a contract on that grain. Many times you're not going to be expected to do it, but sometimes you are, and you have to. So that's the futures market, and it's a kind of technology. It makes it possible also to trade over long distances. Let me talk about that very briefly. So if you are a grain trader and there's 2 bushels of wheat for every person living west of the Rhine that's shipped across the Atlantic Ocean by 1868. So there's a massive amount of American grain that's going mostly to Europe, also to India and other places, but the primary market is Europe. And the problem is the fluctuations in the prices of that grain mean that merchants who are grain merchants would make a margin of about 30%. So they would buy grain at one price and then sell it for about 30% higher. They would store it in a warehouse. They charged a markup that was fairly substantial. And between the farmer, so there's multiple middlemen, and the miller who's finally buying the grain. What a futures market allows someone like Leopold Louis Dreyfus, who's sitting in Paris, to do is to buy December grain in Chicago and sell it on the same day, December grain, in London. And that means he could sell a whole lot more of it because there's no danger about the price, right? He buys it at 70, he sells it at 71 or 72 or whatever, it doesn't matter. Long as it's, he just makes sure that he's not going to sell it for any less than he's bought it for. But he can sell it on the same day because he's got a telegraph. There's an underwater telegraph by 1868. So he can send his orders all the way to Chicago, order that grain, and know what the price is, right? So he doesn't have to engage in the futures market at all, but he's lucky there is a futures market because he can buy that future grain. Right, the ticker tape is going to show him that grain, but he's actually literally going to buy it. He's going to literally telegraph somebody in Chicago and say, buy 500,000 December wheat, and we're going to put it on a ship and send it out to London. And then he's going to, on the same day, sell December wheat in London, and he's going to make 1% on this, but he's going to sell a vastly larger amount of it. And so the people who are destroyed in this process are all those grain merchants who have warehouses who are used to charging 20 to 30%. And that's the Panic of 1873. A whole system of delivery around the world based on warehouses and holding things and charging 20 to 30% starts to go away in these commodities over time. Does that make sense? Okay. And this is how, what is her name? Louise Dreyfus. What's the person who's on that TV show? Whose last name is Louis Dreyfus? What's the? Seinfeld, right? Woman in Seinfeld. She's one of the richest people in the world. I think her father has died. Elaine, right? Because she's the primary heir to the Louis Dreyfus fortune. So there were a number of international grain traders, just few, A, B, C, D, American, I forget what B is, Continental, and Dreyfus. And these grain traders make use of a futures market that's sort of worldwide. Okay, so borrowed machinery, we talked about British steam engines, German machine tool industry, and tools that make things. Small scale industries that make custom devices are really important in places like Chicago and Detroit, Philadelphia, and Boston. And then specialized equipment is emerging in this period, like cigarette rolling machines and machines that make pots. This is very capital intensive and a very rigid structure, but these are technologies also, technologies that enable these very large scale industrial strategy. The other thing that's borrowed is management. The railroad industry becomes the source for most big businesses, that people first start working for the railroads and then move into other areas. Right, that's where James B. Duke and American Tobacco starts. So there's not really a training ground for people who monitor other people, but what you need in a very large hierarchical organization like a steel factory or a watchmaking factory or something like that is people who kind of monitor other people and do cost accounting and things like that. It begins in the railroads, and then those people are hired away into other businesses. They have to monitor the movement of dozens of train schedules, of car changes initially. They become middle managers, what we can now call middlemen, people who manage things, costs, schedules, and they're a new kind of person who wears a white collar. But literally, it's a paper white collar. These are men. And they wear a paper white collar, which they change every day. And the white collar demonstrates that they don't sweat when they work. And so where the phrase white collar comes from. Another important factor in creating this sort of international world, where are we at in terms of time? Okay, we've got a few more minutes, is a new understanding of disease that comes in Louis Pasteur in the 1850s determines that bacteria are little things. They are, that you can see with a microscope, and they can be boiled away. And this understanding, it's in the 1870s, and it basically is an explanation for how and why canning works. So instead of having things heavily salted or filled with alcohol, the way previously you'd ship things in the Middle Ages and forward, you can actually have things that are more or less sweet in, right, and miasma theory, the theory of miasma, that basically disease comes from spooky smells and can be generated anywhere, disappear. We're going to talk about that some later. Okay. Finally, we're at We've got 5 minutes. Let me just tell you some other. So in the 18th century, the model for industrialization around the world was Britain. And in the 19th century, the model around the world uh, is the United States, becomes the United States. And the United States goes from being a minor player in the international economy to being a major player in the international economy. People's understanding of what happens in the United States leads to a lot of changes around the world. So one example, Nikolai Lenin, or Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, when the Soviet Union is created in 1917 or after 1917, says, watching the United States, he says, what we need to do is nationally subsidize heavy industry. Why? Because the US had tariffs. So there has to be support for heavy industry. He also says that there has to be national ownership of farmland and collectivization of farmland, so that all the land has to be collectively owned by peasant groups. This turned out to be not a spectacular move, to say the least. We see massive famines take place in Russia as Lenin tries to emulate the American system by creating these Russian factories are very efficient and they're modeled on American factories, but they're what we see is massive famines in this period. And I think that's largely because we need to understand that the family farm is actually, in some ways, the groundwork for this society. That the technological advancement is absolutely there in Russia. In fact, Russia is far ahead of the United States in physics and chemistry and agriculture in some ways by the beginning of the 20th century. But this collective farm ownership plan leads to spectacular failures. Mao in China in the 1950s also tries to support critical industries, copying the US and British industry. He ignores patents, very much like the United States does. Basically, there are patents, but stealing from technology from Germany and Britain is basically the MO of the United States. It becomes the MO of China in the 1950s. One of the problems with Mao's order is it's also a collective farm ownership, which means that the sagging factor in China is grain, and in this case rice, and it doesn't produce enough food. You don't have that many famines in China, but there are lots of serious problems with food delivery, and China has to end up importing more and more grain, mostly from the United States, actually. There's also a cultural revolution in China in the 1960s, in which intellectuals are attacked. There is a consolidation of languages into what we call Mandarin Chinese, but the Chinese call Putonghua, or the people's language. And that was actually a great and important innovation, the stabilization and centralization of a central language in China, in Chinese. But attacking intellectuals was, which was connected with a kind of internal conflicts going on, meant that the fundamental technologies in China fall apart. Lots of some intellectuals are killed, some of them escape. And finally, Perón in Argentina also tries to put up tariff barriers, just like the United States does. This leads to some development, but also lots of a kind of very backward agricultural system. The World Bank now, in pushing for changes in the rest of the world, has argued that removing tariff barriers is the central thing that every state has to do, and that there ought to be no support for social services, and social services should be subtracted, so that these other places that have lots of social services, those are too costly for the state and they need to be declined. The result is economic growth and economic development in those places, but also tremendous inequality, as we see in the Gilded Age. So understanding the Gilded Age is important for understanding the rest of the world, not just because the US becomes this sort of international superpower, but also because attempts to sort of explain what happens in the Gilded Age lead to massive and important transformations all over the world. Okay. Thanks so much. We're going to talk about immigration and other things like that in the next couple of weeks, and race and ideology and those sorts of things. Thanks, everybody.
Professor.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Professor.
Hey.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Just a quick question.
Uh-huh.
Do you know, like, have a timeline for when we should be expecting our papers back?
Oh, yeah, sorry. My trip slowed this down, but it should be a couple days.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a
Thanks
great
a lot.
Wait, I had a quick question too.
Yeah.
I just noticed that we were supposed to do something with Wikipedia.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't explained that. Okay. That's that I'm going to put that off for later. I put it in the. I made the group in a discussion group inside ELC. So I will. I'll thank you for that. On Monday, I'll just explain how to do that. I'll very briefly go through how to edit Wikipedia, and basically what you're going to do is just either correct an error that you see or just add a citation or a little bit of information.
Okay, and then I had one more thing. Yesterday, like how do you do the taking off for being late on like responding to questions or anything? Like, is that?
Oh, so let me see. So I have I have this problem with the way that Packback does things, where there's basically a yes or no for turning things in. So what I've so if you turn it in afternoon, you get after 12 o'clock on Thursday. In the first couple of weeks, you got 0 points. And I went back and then monkeyed with it a little bit. And so basically, if you get it in by Thursday, by midnight, really.
Okay, because last night I actually ended up forgetting about it until like 12 o'clock on Friday, 12 a.m. Friday.
Oh, okay.
So I did it at like 12:10 to 12.
Okay. All right. Well, I will. That's like there's no. So this is basically between me and Packback. I can't really use Packback to give credit, but I might creep up to like Friday morning or something like that to make.
Okay.
To make.
Because I just kind of forgot about it, so I didn't know if I got 0 credit or anything.
Yeah. I mean. According to Packback, you do, and I can't figure out any other way to get it to go in. Obviously, if you write to me, I can adjust the grade, but I'm gonna do some social engineering on the Packback side and make sure that you get credit.
Do you want me to email you so like you
just to remind me? Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll monkey with the algorithms to make sure that you get credit.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Nick.